The venue was stunning, a historic estate surrounded by vibrant gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. My best friend, Nina, and her husband, Mark, had been eagerly anticipating his sister's wedding for months. The entire family was abuzz with excitement. Mark's sister, Allison, had gone all out to ensure her wedding would be unforgettable. I was one of Nina's bridesmaids, which meant I had a front-row seat to the meticulous planning and growing tension between her and Mark in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Nina had complained of feeling distant from him lately, and while I tried to reassure her, I noticed that her frustrations often had less to do with him and more with the world of distractions she surrounded herself with. The wedding weekend kicked off with a grand rehearsal dinner. Mark's closest friends from college and work were all present, filling the air with nostalgia and boisterous laughter. As I mingled, I couldn't help but notice Nina lingering a little too long in conversation with one of Mark's old friends, Eric. The familiarity in their body language struck me. A touch on the arm, a shared laugh. Maybe it was innocent, I thought, but something about her demeanor was different. Later that night, Nina confided in me after we returned to our shared suite, sipping champagne and laughing over our failed attempts to walk in heels for hours. "It's like Mark doesn't see me anymore," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something deeper. I wanted to press further but decided against it. Instead, I changed the topic, thinking her feelings might just be wedding stress. The next day was the wedding itself, a whirlwind of ceremonies and emotions. Eric was part of Mark's entourage, and it didn't escape my notice that Nina's gaze seemed to find him in the crowd more often than I felt comfortable acknowledging. I told myself it was nothing, just harmless attention in a weekend full of heightened emotions. The ceremony itself was flawless. Allison looked radiant, her joy filling the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Everyone in attendance seemed captivated by the sheer magic of the moment, including Mark, who was proud to see his sister walk down the aisle. He held Nina's hand during the vows, his thumb lightly brushing against her knuckles. It was a small gesture of affection, but one I noticed Nina didn't reciprocate. Instead, she seemed distracted, her eyes darting around the room. After the ceremony, the reception began in full swing. The estate's grand ballroom was aglow with warm lights, live music, and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. Guests mingled, laughed, and danced the night away. Nina, however, seemed to drift farther from Mark as the evening went on. It was during the toasts when Eric came up to our table. I had met him before at a casual gathering, but tonight he exuded a charm that seemed dialed up just for the occasion. He toasted the bride and groom with a heartfelt speech, but his lingering glances at Nina didn't go unnoticed by me or Mark. "Good speech, man," Mark said, raising his glass, his tone pleasant but edged with something I couldn't quite place. Eric gave a wide grin, clinking glasses with both of them. "Thanks, buddy. Gotta give credit to Allison for being the real star tonight, though. What a wedding." As Eric moved on to mingle with others, Nina excused herself to get another drink. I watched her walk to the bar, my stomach tightening when I noticed Eric following shortly after. They didn't talk right away, but there was an unspoken connection between them as their bodies aligned at the bar. Mark was too engrossed in a conversation with his parents to notice Nina and Eric laughing over drinks. From where I sat, I could see the easy flow of their interaction. The way Eric leaned in closer when she spoke, the subtle flip of her hair, and the spark in her eyes that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. I approached her later as she stood by the dessert table, her cheeks flushed. "Are you okay?" I asked cautiously. "Yeah," she replied quickly, a little too quickly. "Why wouldn't I be?" "You've barely been near Mark all night," I said softly. "Are you guys okay?" Nina hesitated, her gaze falling to the table where Mark sat talking animatedly with his father. "It's nothing," she said, but I could hear the tremble in her voice. Sometimes I feel invisible around him." I wanted to say more, but she walked off before I could find the words. I watched as she drifted back toward Eric, who was standing near the dance floor, his drink in hand. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. Something was brewing, something dangerous. It was the kind of night where lines blur, intentions shift, and inhibitions loosen. The reception wasn't over, but I already felt uneasy about what might come next. As the reception unfolded, the atmosphere grew looser. The band played hit after hit, enticing more people onto the dance floor. Mark was in high spirits, laughing and clapping as he danced with Allison and his mother. Nina, however, had slipped into a different rhythm. She wasn't by Mark's side anymore. Instead, she danced with the bridesmaids, her laughter bright but disconnected, like she was trying to drown out something deeper. I noticed Eric hovering at the edge of the dance floor, his eyes locked on Nina. It was subtle at first, but his intentions became clearer when Nina moved closer to him during one of the songs. The two began dancing together, their movements casual but undeniably charged. A low simmer of tension hung between them, visible to anyone paying attention. Mark, for his part, seemed oblivious. He was deep in conversation with his uncles near the bar, clearly enjoying himself. I wondered if he had noticed Nina's absence, or if he just assumed she was off socializing like everyone else. As the night wore on, the guests began to drift into smaller groups, some retreating to the patio for fresh air, others staying by the dance floor. That's when I saw Nina slip out of the ballroom. She didn't look back, but her movements had a deliberate edge, as though she knew exactly where she was going. Minutes later, Eric followed. I felt a lump rise in my throat. My gut told me something was wrong, but I hesitated to follow them. What if I was overreacting? What if it really was nothing? But as I sat there, staring at the open door leading to the gardens, I couldn't shake the feeling that a line was about to be crossed. I waited a few more moments before quietly slipping out after them. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped onto the stone path leading to the gardens. The estate's grounds were dimly lit with lanterns, casting long shadows that danced in the breeze. It didn't take long to spot them, Nina and Eric, standing under an ivy-covered pergola. They were close, too close. Eric was leaning against one of the wooden beams, his face inches from hers. Nina was laughing softly, her voice carrying a teasing lilt that felt almost foreign to me. Then, it happened. Eric reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her face toward his touch, her eyes locked on his. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced with conflicting emotions, disbelief, anger, confusion. Part of me wanted to rush over and stop her, to drag her back to reality. But another part of me was rooted to the ground, unwilling to disrupt what was happening. And then they kissed. It wasn't a brief, hesitant kiss. It was deliberate and charged, the kind of kiss that left no room for misunderstanding. I turned away, my heart pounding, and stumbled back toward the ballroom. I didn't want to see any more. Inside, the party carried on, oblivious to the betrayal unfolding just steps away. Mark was laughing with his friends, completely unaware of what was happening outside. I found myself sitting at a corner table, gripping the edge of my chair as I tried to process what I had just seen. Nina had crossed the line. There was no going back now. Back inside the ballroom, the contrast between the warmth of the celebration and the icy weight of what I had just witnessed was suffocating. The band played a lively tune, couples spun on the dance floor, and the chatter of happy guests filled the room. Yet, all I could think about was Nina and Eric under that pergola. Their kiss seared into my mind like a brand. I scanned the room, looking for Nina. Minutes passed before she returned, her cheeks flushed, though whether it was from the brisk night air or something else, I couldn't tell. Eric entered through another door moments later, his expression composed but his tie slightly loosened. They didn't look at each other, but the tension between them was undeniable, at least to me. I wanted to confront Nina, to shake her and demand to know what she was thinking. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear. Fear of what this would do to our friendship, fear of the fallout if Mark found out. Instead, I sat frozen at my table, wrestling with the burden of a truth I hadn't asked to carry. Nina returned to Mark's side, her demeanor almost too casual. She looped her arm through his and whispered something in his ear. Mark laughed, clearly oblivious, and pulled her into a playful embrace. Watching them was like witnessing a cruel play, with Mark cast as the unsuspecting fool. I caught Nina's eye as she glanced around the room. For a moment, her smile faltered, and she quickly looked away. Did she know I had seen her? Was she feeling guilty? Or was she simply worried that her secret might already be slipping out of the shadows? As the night wore on, I noticed that Nina seemed torn. She danced with Mark, chatted with other guests, and even managed to look genuinely happy at times. But whenever she thought no one was looking, her gaze would drift back to Eric, who stood near the bar, sipping his drink and watching her with a smug, knowing smile. I couldn't take it anymore. I excused myself from the table and stepped out onto the patio, needing a moment to think. The cool air did little to clear my head. My thoughts were a whirlwind. Nina's betrayal, Mark's blissful ignorance, the risk of everything unraveling. It wasn't long before Nina joined me. I heard the soft click of her heels on the stone before I turned to see her standing a few feet away, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Hey," she said softly, her tone cautious. "Hey," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Are you okay? You've been quiet all night." "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my words pointed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, searching my face for clues. "What's that supposed to mean?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "I saw you," I said quietly, "outside, with Eric." Her face went pale. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. It wasn't supposed to happen. That doesn't make it okay, Nina." My voice was firmer now, the weight of my disappointment cutting through the night. "I know," she whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "I know it's wrong, but I've been so lost. Mark doesn't see me anymore. And Eric, he made me feel alive." "That's not an excuse," I said sharply, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You're married, Nina, and he's Mark's friend." She flinched, as though my words had struck her physically. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "don't tell Mark. Not tonight. I just need to figure things out." I stared at her, my stomach churning with anger and sadness. "You'd better figure it out fast," I said finally, "because secrets like this don't stay hidden for long." Nina nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone on the patio with the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a stone. The rest of the evening dragged on like a slow-motion car crash. Nina returned to Mark's side, playing her role flawlessly. She smiled, laughed, and even danced with him again, as though nothing had happened. Eric kept his distance, blending into the crowd, but I couldn't unsee the subtle glances he cast in her direction whenever he thought no one was watching. Meanwhile, I was struggling to hold myself together. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it a one-time lapse in judgment, or was there more to their connection? Most pressing of all, what was I supposed to do with this knowledge? By the time the band announced the final song of the night, I was exhausted, both mentally and emotionally. Mark, still unaware, pulled Nina close as they swayed to the soft melody. For a moment, they looked like the perfect couple, but I knew better now, and that knowledge felt like a knife twisting in my chest. The reception wound down, and guests began to leave in small groups. Mark insisted on seeing his family off, leaving Nina by herself near the entrance. She lingered there, looking lost in thought, until Eric approached. They exchanged a few quiet words, their conversation brief but heavy with unspoken tension. I kept my distance, watching as Eric walked away, disappearing into the night. Nina stood there for a moment longer before turning and heading back inside, her expression unreadable. When I finally retreated to my suite, I expected Nina to follow shortly after. But when she didn't, I found myself pacing the room, replaying the events of the night in my head. I considered going to her room, confronting her again, demanding answers. But I hesitated, unsure if it was my place to intervene any further. Then, just as I was about to call it a night, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Nina standing there, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She sat on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands nervously. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like my whole life is spiraling out of control." "You need to stop, Nina," I said, sitting across from her. Before you do something you can't take back. Whatever's going on between you and Eric, it has to end. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I know you're right, but I don't even know how to face Mark anymore. How do I look him in the eye after what I've done? You tell him the truth, I said firmly, or you fix this, whatever this is, before he finds out on his own. She looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. You can't tell him, she pleaded. Please, let me figure this out. I'll fix it, I promise. I sighed, my heart heavy. This isn't about me keeping your secrets, Nina. It's about you doing the right thing. But I'll give you the chance to clean this up, on one condition. She swallowed hard. What is it? This ends tonight. No more Eric. No more secrets. You have to make a choice. Nina nodded, her expression solemn. I will, she promised. I'll end it. I just need some time. As she left my room, I couldn't help but wonder if she meant what she said, or if this was just another empty promise to buy herself more time. One thing was certain. The cracks in Nina's marriage were growing wider by the second, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The morning after the wedding dawned quiet and subdued. Most of the guests had left early, their laughter and energy from the night before replaced by the subdued rustling of staff clearing the remnants of the reception. I met Nina at breakfast in the estate's dining room, where a few stragglers lingered over coffee and pastries. She looked exhausted, her makeup hastily applied to mask the redness around her eyes. Mark, by contrast, was chipper, recapping the night with enthusiasm as he relived every detail of his sister's big day. Nina smiled faintly, nodding at the appropriate moments, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. Eric wasn't at breakfast. Whether it was out of discretion or pure coincidence, his absence created a brief reprieve. For a moment, it felt like things could return to normal, even if I knew that was impossible. As breakfast wound down, Mark excused himself to help Allison load gifts into their parents' car. Nina and I were left alone at the table, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I'm ending it, she said quietly, her voice so low I almost didn't hear her. Good, I replied, keeping my tone firm. But you need to do it now, before it gets worse. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her coffee cup. I'll talk to him before we leave. I wanted to believe her, but there was a part of me that doubted she had the strength to follow through. Eric had a way of drawing her in, of making her feel seen in a way she clearly craved. Would she really be able to walk away? Later that afternoon, the remaining guests began to pack up and leave. Mark, Nina, and I were among the last to check out, waiting in the grand lobby for the valet to bring our cars around. Eric appeared then, casually leaning against a pillar, his overnight bag slung over one shoulder. Nina stiffened as their eyes met, her expression a mix of guilt and longing. Mark, oblivious, greeted Eric with a friendly wave. Hey man, Mark said. You heading out too? Yeah, Eric replied, his voice smooth and easy. It was a great weekend. Thanks for letting me crash the party. Of course, Mark said with a grin. Wouldn't have been the same without you. As Mark turned to retrieve their car keys from the valet, Eric's eyes flicked back to Nina. The brief, almost imperceptible glance they exchanged spoke volumes. It was a silent, electric moment that made my stomach twist. Whatever Nina had promised me that morning, it was clear the bond between her and Eric wasn't so easily severed. Before I could intervene, Eric walked over to Nina. He kept his distance, but the air between them was charged. Can we talk? He asked, his voice low enough that Mark couldn't hear. Nina hesitated, glancing nervously at me before nodding. Just for a minute. I followed them with my eyes as they stepped a few feet away, their conversation hushed but animated. Eric leaned in slightly, his posture pleading, while Nina crossed her arms defensively. Whatever was being said, it was clear Eric wasn't ready to let her go. After a few tense moments, Nina shook her head firmly and turned to walk away. Eric stood there, watching her retreat with a mixture of frustration and resignation. He didn't follow her, and when she rejoined Mark and me, her expression was resolute, though her hands were still trembling. It's over, she said quietly as Mark approached with the car. I told him it's done. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But as Eric walked out of the estate, disappearing down the long driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It felt more like the beginning of something far more dangerous. The drive home was uneventful, but the tension between Nina and me lingered like a shadow. Mark, oblivious as ever, chatted animatedly about the weekend, laughing about his relatives and recapping his favorite moments from the reception. Nina responded with just enough enthusiasm to mask her inner turmoil, while I sat silently in the back seat, watching the scenery blur past the window. When we arrived at their house, Mark insisted on unloading the car himself, cheerfully hauling bags and suitcases inside. Nina hung back with me on the driveway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice so low I had to strain to hear it. "For what?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my tone. "For not telling Mark? Or for letting you pretend nothing happened?" Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, a flash of guilt crossing her face. "For giving me the chance to fix this. I meant what I said. I ended it." I sighed, leaning against the car. "I hope you're telling the truth, Nina, because if Mark finds out another way, it's going to destroy him." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded. "I know. I'm done with Eric. I swear." Before I could say anything else, Mark called for us from the doorway, waving us inside. Nina straightened her shoulders and plastered on a smile, walking ahead of me into the house. I followed slowly, the weight of what I knew pressing down on me. The next few days were eerily quiet. Nina seemed to throw herself into repairing her relationship with Mark, going out of her way to spend more time with him and shower him with affection. She cooked his favorite meals, joined him for evening walks, and even organized a movie night at home, something she hadn't done in months. Mark, naturally, was thrilled. He beamed like a man who believed everything in his world was finally falling into place. I watched it all from the sidelines, torn between relief that Nina was trying to make things right and frustration that she hadn't come clean about what had happened. But even as Nina played the role of the perfect wife, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She seemed jumpy, her phone always tucked out of sight. Every time it buzzed, she glanced at it quickly before locking the screen, her expression unreadable. One afternoon, I caught her staring out the window, her face drawn and pensive. "Are you okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. She startled, turning to me with a forced smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking about everything." "Everything," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Or Eric?" Her eyes widened slightly, and she shook her head. "I told you, it's over. I haven't talked to him since the wedding." I wanted to believe her, but the way she avoided my gaze told me there was more to the story. Before I could press further, Mark walked into the room, and the conversation ended abruptly. That evening, as I lay in bed replaying the day's events in my mind, my phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "I need to talk to you. Please don't tell Mark." I stared at the message, my heart sinking. It seemed the calm of the past few days was only an illusion. Whatever Nina was about to say, I had a feeling it would unravel everything. Nina and I met in a quiet cafe on the other side of town the next day. She'd been insistent that we talk somewhere neutral, away from Mark, away from any chance of interruption. As I sat across from her at a small corner table, I could see the tension etched into her face. She stirred her coffee absently, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't know who else to turn to," she began, her voice barely audible over the soft murmur of the cafe. "You're the only one who knows." "That's because you've put me in the middle of this," I replied, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Nina, what's going on? You said you ended things with Eric. Was that a lie?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I haven't spoken to him since the wedding. But he sent me a message." My stomach tightened. "What kind of message?" She hesitated, pulling her phone from her bag and sliding it across the table. I picked it up and read the screen. The text from Eric was short but direct. "I'm not ready to let this go. We need to talk." "He's not giving up," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. I thought if I ignored him, he'd move on, but he's persistent." I set the phone down, staring at her. "You need to block him, Nina. Right now. If you're serious about fixing things with Mark, You can't let Eric have any way of reaching you. I know, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. But what if he doesn't stop? What if he tells Mark? Then you'd better be prepared to tell Mark yourself, I said bluntly. Because if he hears it from Eric first, it's going to be 100 times worse. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. I can't lose Mark, she choked out. I love him. I made a mistake, but I love him. I softened slightly, my anger tempered by the raw vulnerability in her voice. If that's true, then you need to act like it. No more secrets, Nina. You block Eric, and you start being honest with Mark. Maybe not about everything, not yet, but you can't keep lying to him. She nodded slowly, swiping at her tears. Okay, she said. I'll block him, and I'll tell Mark something. I just need more time. When we left the cafe, Nina promised me she would cut Eric off for good. I watched her walk away, hoping she meant it this time. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. Eric's persistence, Nina's guilt. It was a volatile combination, and it felt like the truth was inching closer to the surface with every passing day. Back at home, Mark greeted us with his usual warmth, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. He kissed Nina on the cheek and asked about her day, his smile so genuine it made my chest ache. Nina answered him lightly, her voice steady, but I could see the strain in her posture. She was carrying a weight she couldn't hide forever, and I knew it was only a matter of time before that weight crushed her, or their marriage. As I watched them together that evening, laughing over dinner, a knot of dread settled in my stomach. Nina thought she could handle this on her own, but Eric's refusal to let go felt like the beginning of the end. And when the truth finally came out, I doubted any of us would be prepared for the fallout. The truth unraveled in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't Eric who exposed the affair, nor was it Nina finally confessing. Instead, it was Mark who stumbled upon the betrayal, and when it happened, the destruction was as swift as it was devastating. It started innocently enough. Mark had decided to plan a weekend getaway for him and Nina, a surprise to rekindle their connection. He asked me to help him find the perfect destination and arrange the logistics. While he was working on the details, he borrowed Nina's tablet to check for travel deals and stumbled across her messaging app. I was in the kitchen when I heard Mark's voice from the living room, sharp and brittle. What the hell is this? I froze, my heart pounding as I walked into the room. Mark was standing, his face pale, holding Nina's tablet. His eyes were wide, his voice rising. Who the hell is Eric? And why is he telling my wife he's not ready to let her go? Nina, who had been sitting on the couch, shot to her feet. Mark, let me explain. Explain? Mark barked, his tone venomous. Explain what, Nina? That you've been sneaking around with one of my friends? That you've been lying to me while pretending everything is fine? Tears streamed down Nina's face as she tried to reach for him, but he pulled away, his expression twisting with anger and disbelief. I trusted you, Mark said, his voice breaking. I've spent months trying to fix things between us, thinking it was my fault we were drifting apart. And the whole time, you've been doing this? With Eric? It wasn't like that, Nina cried. It wasn't serious. It was a mistake, Mark. I ended it. A mistake? Mark spat. You don't accidentally kiss someone. You don't accidentally have an emotional affair behind your husband's back. How long has this been going on? Nina hesitated, her hesitation answering the question for her. Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. That's what I thought. I stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or leave them to their implosion. Mark's hands trembled as he placed the tablet on the coffee table, his eyes dark with betrayal. You lied to me, he said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. You lied, Nina, and I don't think I can forgive you for this. Please, Nina sobbed, her voice breaking. Please, Mark, we can work through this. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut Eric off completely. Just don't leave me. Mark stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, without another word, he grabbed his jacket and keys and walked out the door, leaving Nina sobbing on the floor. Hours passed before Mark returned. When he did, he didn't speak to either of us. He went straight to the guest room, and closed the door behind him. Nina sat in silence on the couch, her face buried in her hands, while I lingered awkwardly, unsure how to console either of them. The next morning, Mark emerged with a calm that was almost more unsettling than his anger. He didn't yell, didn't argue. Instead, he spoke in a low, steady voice that cut through the air like a blade. "I need some space," he said simply, looking directly at Nina. "I'm staying with my sister for a while. Don't call me. Don't text me. I'll be in touch when I'm ready." Nina tried to protest, but Mark held up a hand, silencing her. Then he turned and walked out the door, leaving the house eerily quiet in his absence. For the first time since this ordeal began, Nina looked truly broken. But as I watched her sitting alone on the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. Mark might have left, but his silence felt like the calm before something far more devastating. Mark's absence stretched into days, then a week. During that time, Nina seemed to unravel, torn between guilt and the gnawing uncertainty of what Mark's next move might be. She tried to reach him through calls, texts, and even his sister, but Mark was resolute in his silence. His refusal to engage was a deafening response in itself. I wasn't sure what Mark was planning, but when he finally broke his silence, his actions spoke louder than words. It started with the lawyer's letter that arrived one morning. Nina had barely touched her coffee when the doorbell rang. She returned moments later, clutching the envelope with trembling hands. I watched as she opened it, her face growing pale as she read the contents. "He's filing for divorce," she whispered, her voice cracking. The letter wasn't just about divorce. It was a strategic dismantling of their life together. Mark had already frozen their joint accounts, leaving Nina unable to access the funds they shared. He also included documentation of her affair with Eric, ensuring that her infidelity would play a significant role in the proceedings. But Mark wasn't content to stop at legal action. As the days passed, he began to make subtle, calculated moves that upended Nina's world even further. Word of Nina's infidelity began to spread among their social circle, and it didn't take long for the whispers to reach her workplace. A few days after receiving the divorce papers, Nina came home in tears, clutching a cardboard box filled with her belongings. "They fired me," she sobbed, collapsing onto the couch. "Someone told HR about the affair, and they said it reflects poorly on the company. I didn't need to ask who might have leaked the information." Mark's methodical dismantling of Nina's life was both ruthless and precise, leaving her reeling at every turn. Even Eric wasn't spared. Rumors circulated that Mark had sent copies of the messages and photos he'd found to Eric's employer. Within a week, Eric lost his job, too, and his reputation was in tatters. I heard through the grapevine that he'd left town, unable to face the fallout. Nina tried to reach Mark again, but every attempt was met with silence. She even drove to his sister's house one night, only to be turned away at the door. The rejection hit her like a physical blow, and when she returned home, she was a mess of tears and frustration. "I just want to talk to him," she cried. "I need to explain." "Explain what?" I interrupted, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "You cheated on him, Nina. He gave you his trust, and you broke it. What more is there to say?" Her eyes flashed with anger, but it quickly gave way to despair. "I know I messed up," she said quietly, "but I never thought he'd do this. He's ruining me." "No," I replied sharply. "You ruined yourself. Mark is just making sure you feel the consequences." Mark's final act of revenge came in the form of a public announcement. He posted a message on social media, thanking friends and family for their support during this difficult time, and revealing that his marriage had ended due to irreconcilable differences stemming from betrayal. While he didn't name Nina or Eric outright, the message was clear enough for anyone who knew the situation. The post went viral among their circle, drawing an outpouring of sympathy for Mark and condemnation for Nina. For Nina, it was the final blow. She spent hours scrolling through the comments, her face crumpling with each one. "I don't know how I'll recover from this," she whispered, her voice hollow. I didn't have an answer for her. Mark's revenge had been devastatingly effective, leaving Nina's life in ruins. But as much as I sympathized with her pain, I couldn't ignore the truth. She'd brought this on herself, and now she had no choice but to face the consequences. Nina's world had been thoroughly dismantled, and the cracks that had started at the wedding had become chasms she could no longer navigate. She spent days in bed, curtains drawn, as the weight of Mark's actions and the fallout from her own choices pressed down on her. It was hard to feel sympathy for her when I thought about Mark, about the devastation in his eyes when he uncovered the truth. I had barely spoken to Mark since his departure, but through mutual friends, I'd learned he was thriving in the wake of the chaos. He'd thrown himself into work, started spending more time with Allison and her husband, and even signed up for a gym membership. It seemed like he was determined to rebuild his life from the ashes of their marriage. Nina, however, struggled to find her footing. With no job, no steady income, and her reputation in tatters, she was forced to downsize her lifestyle significantly. She moved out of their shared home, leaving behind the remnants of her former life, and rented a small apartment in a less desirable part of town. It wasn't what she was used to, but it was all she could afford. One evening, as I sat with her in her sparsely furnished living room, she broke the silence with a quiet confession. "I keep thinking about all the little choices I made," she said, her voice heavy. "All the times I could have stopped myself but didn't. And now I'm here." Her gaze was distant, fixed on some point beyond the walls of her apartment. "I ruined everything, didn't I?" I didn't sugarcoat my response. "Yeah, you did. But that doesn't mean it's over. You can start again, Nina. You just have to own what you've done." She nodded slowly, though her expression betrayed her doubt. "I don't even know where to start." "Start by letting Mark go," I said firmly. "You can't keep chasing him or hoping he'll forgive you. He's moved on, and you need to do the same." Tears filled her eyes, but she nodded again, this time with more determination. "You're right," she whispered. "It's just hard to accept." Nina took small steps toward rebuilding her life. She started therapy, something she had resisted for years, and began searching for work in an entirely new field. She wanted to leave behind not just the stigma of her past, but also the version of herself that had made those mistakes. Through it all, I stayed by her side, though my patience was often tested. There were days when she wallowed in self-pity, unable to see a way forward. But there were also moments of clarity, glimpses of the woman she was trying to become. She wrote a letter to Mark, though she never sent it. In it, she apologized, not just for the affair but for the years of neglect and unspoken resentment that had led to their collapse. She admitted her faults, her failures, and her regrets, pouring her heart onto the page in a way she never had before. "It's for me, not him," she explained when she showed it to me. "I just needed to say it, even if he never hears it." Mark, meanwhile, had started dating again. I saw him once at a mutual friends gathering, looking healthier and happier than I'd ever seen him. When we spoke briefly, he mentioned that he was seeing someone new, a coworker who had helped him through the toughest parts of the divorce. "She's great," he said, smiling. "And she's honest. That's all I need right now." It was clear that Mark was determined to move forward, leaving Nina and the pain she'd caused firmly in the past. As I watched him laugh with his new partner across the room, I realized that the chapter of Nina and Mark's life together had truly come to an end. For Nina, the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time since that fateful wedding, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a small but steady light guiding her toward the person she wanted to be. Months passed, and Nina's progress was slow but steady. Therapy became her anchor, giving her the tools to unpack the choices that had led to her betrayal and the fallout that followed. She'd stopped reaching out to Mark entirely, respecting the boundaries he'd set. Instead, she focused on herself, trying to piece together a life from the wreckage. One afternoon, as we sat together over coffee, she showed me a sketch pad filled with designs. "I'm thinking about starting a small business," she said, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "Something creative. Maybe handmade jewelry or decor." It was the most animated I'd seen her in months. For the first time, she wasn't dwelling on her mistakes or the life she'd lost. She was looking forward, imagining a future she could build for herself. "I think that's a great idea," I said, genuinely impressed. "You need something that's yours, something you can pour your energy into." She smiled, a small flicker of confidence returning. I just want to feel like I'm doing something good again. Despite her progress, Nina's past wasn't entirely behind her. Some friendships had been irrevocably damaged, and there were places she avoided entirely for fear of running into familiar faces. But as she worked to rebuild, she began to accept that she couldn't control how others saw her. All she could control was who she became moving forward. Mark's life, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. Mutual friends reported that he was still with his new partner, and they seemed genuinely happy. He'd even taken up new hobbies, like photography and hiking, throwing himself into the things he'd once neglected during his marriage. Occasionally, I wondered if Mark ever thought about Nina, if there was any part of him that missed her or mourned what they'd shared. But when I saw him again at another gathering, his focus was entirely on his new partner, his demeanor warm and relaxed. We spoke briefly, and I asked how he was doing. "Better than I've been in years," he said, smiling. "I've learned a lot about myself through all this. It's been hard, but I think it was what I needed." I didn't press further. It was clear that Mark had closed that chapter of his life and wasn't interested in revisiting it. For Nina, closure came in the form of forgiveness, not from Mark, but from herself. One evening, during one of our conversations, she told me, "I'll never stop regretting what I did to him. But I'm learning that regret doesn't mean I have to hate myself forever. I can still do better. Be better." It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was a beginning. She started volunteering at a local shelter, using her free time to give back to her community. She launched her small business, slowly gaining traction through word of mouth and social media. And while she wasn't ready to date again, she didn't rule it out for the future. "I just want to make sure I'm whole before I bring someone else into my life," she said one day. "I don't want to repeat my mistakes." As I watched Nina take these tentative steps toward redemption, I felt a mix of relief and hope. She was far from perfect, and her journey was far from over. But she was trying, truly trying, to become someone better than the person who had made those fateful choices. For Mark, the story had ended. For Nina, it was only just beginning. It had been a year since the wedding that set everything in motion. The lives of everyone involved had shifted in ways none of us could have predicted. For Mark, the pain of betrayal had become a scar, a reminder of what he'd endured but also of how far he'd come. For Nina, it was a constant motivator, pushing her to rebuild herself from the ground up. I saw Mark one last time at Allison's birthday party. He was there with his new girlfriend, a kind, grounded woman who seemed to complement him perfectly. They were happy, effortlessly in sync, and seeing him like that filled me with a strange mix of sadness and satisfaction. He deserved this, a fresh start with someone who valued him the way he deserved. We shared a quiet moment during the party, stepping away from the crowd to talk. "You look good, Mark," I said, meaning it. He smiled. "Thanks. Life's good now. I feel like I finally found my footing again." I hesitated before speaking, unsure if I should broach the topic. "Have you forgiven her?" I asked cautiously. Mark's expression softened, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word," he said, "but I don't hate her anymore. What happened? It taught me a lot. About myself, about what I want and what I won't settle for. I wish her well, but she's not part of my story anymore." As for Nina, her journey was less tidy but no less important. She'd found stability in her new life, though it was far from the one she had envisioned when she married Mark. Her small business had started to grow, and she was building a network of new friends, people who didn't know her as the woman who had once imploded her marriage. One evening, we sat in her apartment, sharing takeout and reminiscing about how far she had come. "Do you think he's happy?" she asked suddenly, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I think he's content," I said honestly, "and I think you should want that for him." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I do. I really do. I'll always regret how it ended." "You can't undo the past, Nina," I said gently, "but you're doing the work now. That matters." She smiled faintly, wiping her eyes. "It's strange. For so long, I thought my life was over. But now, I don't know. Maybe it's just beginning." The story of Mark and Nina wasn't a happy one, but it wasn't entirely tragic either. It was a tale of choices and consequences, of betrayal and redemption, of endings and new beginnings. Mark had found a way to thrive, carving out a life of joy and love. Nina, too, was moving forward, determined to create a better version of herself, even if it meant walking a harder road. And for me, caught in the middle of it all, the experience left me with one undeniable truth. Sometimes, life doesn't give us closure wrapped in a neat bow. Sometimes, the only thing we can do is move forward, carrying the lessons of the past while leaving its burdens behind. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough.